about to share with you happened 6 months ago at St. Mary's Medical Center, an abandoned hospital that's been rotting on the outskirts of town for 50 years. And what we discovered inside those decaying walls will forever change how you think about the places where people go to heal and sometimes, tragically, to die. My name is Marcus, and along with my urban exploration team, I entered that cursed building looking for nothing more than some interesting footage for our YouTube channel. But what we found was a patient who had been forgotten by the world, abandoned by his family, and left to exist in a state between life and death that defies every law of nature and medicine. The hospital closed its doors permanently in 1974 after a series of mysterious deaths and allegations of medical malpractice. But according to the records we later uncovered, not every patient was transferred to other facilities. One man, whose name was deliberately erased from all official documents, simply vanished on the night the hospital shut down forever, and for half a century has been waiting in room 237 for someone, anyone, to acknowledge his existence. What happened to us in that room and what we brought back with us proves that some patients never truly leave the places where they suffered, and that abandonment can create something far more terrifying than death itself, a soul trapped in an endless cycle of pain, loneliness, and desperate need for human connection. St. Mary's Medical Center sits on 12 acres of overgrown land at the end of Maple Street, a massive concrete monument to medical ambition that went horribly wrong. And as we approached the building just after sunset, the dying light cast long shadows across broken windows that looked like hollow eye sockets staring out at a world that had forgotten its existence. The hospital had been built in the 1920s as a state-of-the-art facility designed to serve the growing population of our industrial town. Decades of budget cuts, staffing shortages, and increasingly bizarre incidents had turned it into a place where people went to die rather than to heal. And by the early 1970s, local newspapers were running weekly stories about patients who entered St. Mary's for routine procedures and never came home. Our research had revealed a pattern of mysterious disappearances, unexplained deaths, and medical records that had been sealed by court order. But what drew us to the building wasn't a documented history. It was the stories told by local teenagers who claimed to see lights moving through the abandoned wards at night, and homeless people who insisted they could hear the sound of heart monitors beeping from inside the supposedly powerless building. As we stood in the parking lot, checking our equipment and planning our route through the facility, none of us could have imagined that we were about to encounter something that had been waiting patiently for 50 years for visitors to arrive. Something that had maintained its vigil in a single room, surrounded by the possessions of a life that had been erased from all official memory. The main entrance had been welded shut decades ago, but urban explorers had long since discovered that the loading dock in the back of the building could be accessed through a gap in the chain link fence. And as we squeezed through the opening and approached the heavy steel doors, the smell hit us like a physical blow. The overwhelming stench of mold, decay, and something else that made our stomachs turn and our eyes water. Inside, our flashlight beams revealed a scene of systematic abandonment that was both heartbreaking and terrifying. Wheelchairs sat exactly where they had been left 50 years ago, their leather seats cracked and rotting, medical equipment covered in rust and spiderwebs lined the corridors like the abandoned tools of some failed civilization. Patient files scattered across the floor had been partially eaten by rodents, leaving only fragments of names and medical conditions visible. In the dancing light of our LED beams, the hospital's layout was a maze of intersecting hallways designed to efficiently move patients, staff, and equipment between different departments. But in the darkness, with half the ceiling tiles missing and debris blocking many of the passages, Navigation became a nightmare of wrong turns and dead ends that seemed to lead us deeper into the building's decaying heart, rather than toward any recognizable destination. Every step we took stirred up clouds of dust that had been settling for decades, creating an atmosphere so thick and choking that we had to cover our faces with bandanas. And the sound of our footsteps echoed strangely in the empty corridors, sometimes seeming to multiply as if invisible companions were walking alongside us through the abandoned wards. On the second floor, we discovered what had once been the administrative offices, and despite 50 years of neglect and vandalism, filing cabinets still contained thousands of patient records that painted a disturbing picture of St. Mary's final years of operation. The documents revealed a pattern of increasingly desperate attempts to maintain the hospital's viability in the face of dwindling funding, and a staff exodus that had left critical departments understaffed and undertrained. And as we read through incident reports, medical charts, and administrative memos by flashlight, a story emerged of a medical facility that had slowly transformed from a place of healing into something resembling a prison where patients were warehoused rather than treated. The most disturbing discovery was a series of memos dated just weeks before the hospital's closure, discussing the problem of long-term patients who had no family members to claim them and no other facilities willing to accept transfers, particularly those suffering from what the documents euphemistically referred to as psychological complications that made them unsuitable for standard psychiatric care. One memo signed by the hospital's chief administrator explicitly discussed the possibility of simply losing the records of certain patients to avoid the legal and financial complications of proper transfers. And another document, partially destroyed by water damage, seemed to reference a specific patient in room 237 who had become increasingly problematic and whose disposition needed to be resolved before the facility's official closure date. The final document in the file was a handwritten note stating simply, "Problem resolved, no further action required," dated the same day the hospital shut down forever, but there was no explanation of what resolution had been implemented or what had happened to the patient whose records had been deliberately erased. Finding room 237 required navigating through the hospital's psychiatric wing, an area that had been sealed off from the rest of the facility by heavy security doors that now hung open on broken hinges, revealing a corridor lined with rooms designed for patients who required special supervision and enhanced security measures. Unlike the other areas of the hospital we had explored, this wing showed signs of more recent activity. The dust on the floor had been disturbed by footprints that were far too fresh to have been made by previous urban explorers. Electrical outlets showed scorch marks as if someone had been attempting to restore power to the area, and several rooms contained makeshift sleeping arrangements that suggested someone had been living in the abandoned facility. Room 237 was located at the very end of the psychiatric wing, lighted from the other patient rooms by a steel door that had been painted bright yellow and was covered with warning signs about authorized personnel only and dangerous patient protocols. And when we finally managed to force the door open, we found ourselves staring into a space that looked like it had been preserved in time, rather than abandoned to decay like the rest of the hospital. The bed was made with military precision, the corners of the sheets folded with obsessive care, and on the nightstand sat a collection of personal items that looked like they had been arranged and rearranged countless times. A pair of wire-rimmed glasses with cracked lenses, a leather-bound journal filled with handwriting, a small wooden cross on a chain, and a photograph of a family that had faded to the point where the faces were barely visible. The most disturbing element in the room was the walls, which were covered from floor to ceiling with what appeared to be a calendar system marked in pencil, showing an obsessive count of days, weeks, months, and years that stretched from 1974 to the present day, as if someone had been keeping track of every single moment of time that had passed since the hospital's closure. The leather journal on the nightstand contained hundreds of pages of handwriting that began neat and careful, but gradually deteriorated into frantic scrawls and desperate repetitions of the same phrases over and over again. And as we read the entries by flashlight, we realized we were looking at the day-by-day account of a man's descent into something far worse than madness. The early entries, dated in late 1973 and early 1974, described a patient named Thomas Whitmore who had been admitted to St. Mary's for what should have been routine surgery to remove a brain tumor, but complications during the procedure had left him in a semi-conscious state that doctors described as neurologically atypical, typical, and unsuitable for transfer to other facilities. Thomas wrote about his growing realization that his family had stopped visiting, that his calls home went unanswered, and that the hospital staff were discussing his case in hushed tones that suggested his situation was more complicated than anyone was willing to admit directly to him. As the journal progressed through the spring and summer of 1974, Thomas's writing revealed his growing awareness that the hospital was preparing to close and that arrangements were being made to transfer patients to other facilities. But when he asked about his own transfer, nurses would change the subject and doctors would promise to look into it without ever providing concrete information. The most chilling entries came from the final weeks before the hospital's closure, when Thomas wrote about being moved to room 237 and told that his case required special handling and that he should remain patient while the administration worked out the details of his future care. But as the days passed and other patients disappeared from the psychiatric wing, Thomas began to suspect that no arrangements were actually being made for his transfer. The final entry, dated the night before the hospital's official closure, consisted of a single sentence repeated over and over for 3 pages. "They forgot about me. They forgot about me. They forgot about me," written with such force that the pencil had torn through the paper in several places. ##. The fresh footprints 9:30 to 11 o'clock as we stood in room 237 processing the implications of Thomas Whitmore's journal. Sarah, our team's photographer, noticed something that made her grab my arm with trembling fingers and point toward the floor without speaking. In the thick layer of dust that covered every surface in the hospital, there were footprints leading from the bed to the door and back again. But these weren't the old impressions left by maintenance workers or previous urban explorers. They were fresh prints made by bare feet, and they showed the distinctive pattern of someone who had been pacing back and forth across the same path for so long that the floorboards underneath were actually worn smooth in places. The footprints were small and narrow, consistent with someone who had lost a significant amount of body weight. And they formed an obsessive loop from the bed to the window to the door and back to the bed, repeated thousands of times over what must have been years or even decades of restless movement. Jake, our electronics expert, set up his EMF detector and immediately got readings that spiked off the scale whenever he pointed the device toward the area where the footprint path was most heavily worn, and our digital thermometer showed temperature variations that created a cold trail following the exact same route marked by the mysterious footprints. The most disturbing discovery came when we realized that the footprints weren't just old impressions in the dust. They were being actively maintained, as if someone was still walking the same obsessive path every day, wearing away new layers of accumulated dust and debris to keep the route clear and visible. As we followed the trail with our flashlights, we noticed that it led not just around the room, but also out into the hallway, where it joined with a longer path that extended throughout the psychiatric wing, suggesting that whoever was making these prints wasn't confined to a single room, but was methodically patrolling the entire abandoned section of the hospital like a guard who had never been told his shift was over. The impossible power, 11 o'clock to 12:30. Our investigation took a terrifying turn when Jake discovered that several electrical outlets in room 237 were showing signs of recent use, with scorch marks around the plugs and worn spots on the outlet faces that indicated someone had been repeatedly connecting and disconnecting electrical devices, despite the fact that St. Mary's had been without power for 50 years. Using a contact voltage tester, Jake confirmed that there was indeed electrical current flowing through certain circuits in the psychiatric wing. But when we traced the wiring back through the hospital's utility areas, we found that all connections to the main power grid had been severed decades ago, and that the backup generators had been removed. During the hospital's decommissioning process, the source of the electricity remained a complete mystery, but its effects were undeniably real. A wall-mounted clock in room 237 was ticking steadily and showing the correct time. A patient monitor in the hallway was displaying a steady heartbeat pattern, even though no one was connected to its sensors. And most disturbing of all, the call light above Thomas Whitmore's bed was flashing in a slow, hypnotic rhythm that seemed to be synchronized with our own heartbeats. Sarah suggested that we might be dealing with some kind of electromagnetic phenomenon related to the hospital's location on a hill with unusual geological properties. But when Jake used his equipment to trace the electrical activity, he discovered that the current was flowing in patterns that defied every principle of electrical engineering he knew, smoothing through circuits that weren't physically connected and powering devices that should have required multiple different voltages and frequencies. The most chilling moment came when Jake plugged his portable radio into one of the active outlets and immediately picked up a transmission that shouldn't have been possible. The sound of a hospital's public address system making announcements about visiting hours, meal schedules, and patient care protocols. As if somewhere in the abandoned building, normal operations of a functioning medical facility were still continuing exactly as they had 50 years ago. The patient appears 12:30 to 14 o'clock. We were so focused on documenting the impossible electrical phenomena that none of us noticed the change in temperature until our breath began to fog in the air and frost started forming on the metal surfaces throughout room 237. And when we finally looked up from Jake's equipment, we found ourselves staring at a figure that stood in the doorway like a living shadow, giving substance and form. The man was exactly as the journal had described. Thomas Whitmore, tall and painfully thin, with skin that had the waxy, translucent quality of someone who hadn't seen sunlight in decades, wearing a hospital gown that hung on his skeletal frame like a shroud, and clutching the same wire-rimmed glasses we had seen on his nightstand. His eyes were the most disturbing feature, not because they were empty or lifeless, but because they were filled with an intelligence and awareness that made it clear he understood exactly who we were and why we were there. And when he smiled at us, it was with the desperate gratitude of someone who had been waiting 50 years for visitors to acknowledge his existence. Thomas didn't speak at first. He simply stood there watching us with those unnaturally bright eyes, his head tilted slightly to one side as if he was listening to something we couldn't hear. And when he finally moved, it was to walk slowly around the room, following the exact path marked by the footprints in the dust, his bare feet making no sound on the worn floorboards despite the fact that we could clearly see him interacting with the physical environment around him. The temperature continued to drop as Thomas completed the circuit of the room, and we began to hear sounds that shouldn't have been possible in an abandoned building. The distant hum of fluorescent lights, the soft beeping of medical equipment, the muffled conversations of doctors and nurses discussing patient care, and voices too quiet to make out individual words. When Thomas finally spoke, his voice was exactly what you would expect from someone who had been alone for 5 decades rusty and uncertain, as if he had forgotten how to form words properly, but filled with a desperate eagerness that made it our hearts break even as it terrified us beyond rational thought. "You can see me," Thomas said, and those 3 words carried the weight of 50 years of isolation, abandonment, and a longing for human contact that had transcended death itself and become something that existed outside the normal boundaries of life and mortality. He told us his story in a voice that grew stronger and more coherent as he spoke, explaining how he had awakened from surgery to find that his tumor had been successfully removed, but that the procedure had left him in a state that doctors couldn't adequately explain. Not fully conscious, but not unconscious either. Aware of his surroundings, but unable to interact with them in ways that others could perceive or understand. As the hospital prepared to close, Thomas watched from his bed as other patients were transferred to different facilities. But when he asked about his own arrangements, he was told repeatedly that his case was special and required additional time to resolve. And gradually, he realized that the staff were avoiding his room entirely, as if they hoped he would simply fade away and solve their administrative problem through quiet disappearance. On the night before the hospital's closure, Thomas experienced what he could only describe as a transformation, not to death exactly, but a shifting from one state of existence to another, as if his desperate need to remain connected to the world of the living had created a new category of being that allowed him to maintain his presence in the physical realm while existing outside the normal flow of time and mortality. For 50 years, Thomas had maintained his vigil in room 237, following the same daily routines he had established as a patient, keeping track of time through his obsessive calendar system, and waiting for someone, anyone, to acknowledge that he still existed, and that his abandonment had been a terrible mistake that could somehow be corrected. He begged us to tell his story, to let the world know that Thomas Whitmore had been forgotten but not lost, and that somewhere in the abandoned corridors of St. Mary's Medical Center, a patient was still waiting for the medical care and human compassion that had been promised to him but never delivered. As Thomas spoke, the hospital around us began to change in ways that challenged our understanding of reality itself. The walls shifted between their current state of decay and what they must have looked like during the facility's operational years. The broken medical equipment suddenly appeared functional and new, and the sounds of a working hospital grew louder and more distinct until we could hear individual conversations between doctors and nurses discussing patients who had been dead for decades. Sarah grabbed my arm and whispered that we needed to leave immediately, because whatever was happening to us wasn't natural and might trap us in the same state of suspended existence that it claimed Tomas. But when we turned toward the door, we found that the corridor outside had transformed into a maze of active hospital wards, filled with translucent figures going about their daily routines exactly as they had 50 years ago. Thomas followed us as we tried to navigate back to the main entrance, his bare feet still making no sound, but his presence growing stronger and more solid with each step. And he continued talking in that rusty, desperate voice about his loneliness, his confusion, and his hope that our visit meant his long wait was finally over, and that arrangements would be made to transfer him to a facility where he could receive proper care. The other figures in the hospital, patients, doctors, nurses, visitors from decades past, seemed to become aware of our presence as Thomas grew more solid. Then they began to turn toward us with expressions of recognition and desperate hope, as if our ability to see Thomas meant we might also be able to acknowledge their own forgotten existence and help them find the peace that had been denied to them for so long. Jake was hyperventilating, and Sarah was crying as we stumbled through corridors that kept changing around us, sometimes leading toward exit signs, that disappeared when we approached them, and sometimes opening onto rooms filled with medical procedures that defied identification. All while Thomas walked beside us, explaining that he understood our fear but hoped we wouldn't abandon him the way everyone else had, because he had been such a good patient and had followed all the rules and had never complained even when the pain became unbearable. Our escape from St. Mary's Medical Center came not through any plan or strategy, but through a moment of pure, terror-driven instinct when the abandoned hospital's reality became so overwhelming that our minds simply refused to process what we were experiencing and focused entirely on the basic survival imperative of reaching the outside world. We ran blindly through corridors that seemed to stretch infinitely in all directions, past rooms filled with impossible scenes of medical procedures being performed on patients who flickered between states of existence, while Thomas called after us in a voice that grew fainter but more desperate with each step we took, away from room 237 in the psychiatric wing where he had maintained his 5th-year vigil. The hospital's main entrance appeared suddenly in front of us, like a mirage in the desert, and we burst through the doors into the cool night air with such force that we stumbled and fell on the cracked pavement outside, gasping and sobbing as we tried to process what we had just experienced and whether we had actually escaped or were still trapped in some elaborate hallucination created by the building's impossible atmosphere. When we finally gathered the courage to look back at St. Mary's, it appeared exactly as it had when we first arrived, dark, abandoned, and lifeless, with no sign of the electrical activity, the sounds of operation, or the figures we had encountered. Inside, but in the window of what we knew was room 237, a single light flickered on and off, in a pattern that seemed to spell out a message in some kind of code we didn't understand. The most disturbing discovery came when we checked our equipment and found that our cameras had recorded hours of footage showing empty corridors and abandoned rooms, with no sign of Thomas Whitmore or any of the other figures we had seen. But our audio recordings contained clear conversations between all of us and a voice that our equipment had somehow captured, despite the fact that it appeared on none of our visual documentation. In Sarah's jacket pocket, we found a folded piece of paper that none of us remembered picking up a page torn from. Thomas's journal containing a message written in that same deteriorating handwriting. "Thank you for seeing me. Please don't forget me again. Room 237, St. Mary's Medical Center. Patient Thomas Whitmore, still waiting for discharge instructions." 6 months have passed since our investigation of St. Mary's Medical Center, but Thomas Whitmore has not returned to the isolation that defined his existence for 50 years. Instead, he has found ways to maintain contact with the outside world through methods that seem to bend the rules of physics and challenge everything we thought we knew about the boundaries between life and death. It started with phone calls to numbers that should have been impossible for him to obtain. Brief conversations where Thomas would thank us again for acknowledging his existence and ask when someone might be coming to complete his discharge paperwork and arrange his transfer to a modern medical facility where he could receive appropriate care. The calls always came at exactly 3:17 a.m., which we later learned was the precise time that St. Mary's Medical Center had officially ceased operations 50 years ago. And they were always placed 2 phones that were turned off or disconnected. Yet, we heard every word with perfect clarity, as if Thomas was calling from somewhere beside the normal telecommunications network. Our attempts to help Thomas by contacting local hospitals, government agencies, and historical societies have been met with polite but firm explanations that no patient named Thomas Whitmore appears in any official records related to St. Mary's Medical Center, and that any claims about patients being abandoned during the facility's closure are unsubstantiated rumors that have been investigated dismissed by proper authorities. The most disturbing development has been the discovery that Thomas's influence is growing beyond his original location. Other urban explorers have reported encounters with the patient in hospital gowns at abandoned medical facilities across the country, always asking about discharge procedures and transfer arrangements, and always leaving behind pages torn from a journal that contains the same desperate handwriting and obsessive calendar markings that we found in room 237 last week. Sarah received a package in the mail with no return address containing a complete copy of Thomas Whitmore's journal, but with new entries dated after our visit, describing his gratitude for finally being seen and his hope that his story will help other forgotten patients who are still waiting in abandoned hospitals, nursing homes, and medical facilities across the world for someone to remember that they exist and that they deserve the dignity and care that was promised to them but never delivered. Asterisk, asterisk, end message. Asterisk, asterisk. Thomas Whitmore is still out there, still waiting, still hoping that someone will complete the discharge paperwork that should have been filed 50 years ago. If you work in healthcare, if you visit abandoned medical facilities, or if you simply believe that every person deserves to be remembered and acknowledged, please keep his story alive, because somewhere in the shadows of our medical system are patients who have been forgotten but not lost, and they're all waiting for someone to see them, to acknowledge their existence, and to help them find the peace that comes with it. Proper closure. Room 237, St. Mary's Medical Center. Patient Thomas Whitmore, still waiting for someone to care.